share with you how I rewrote my past. In other words, how I changed my past. I was coaching a client recently about this topic, excuse me, where she wanted to transition out of the humanitarian sector to starting her own personal brand. And a lot of the stories that she was telling me and sharing was all the struggle stories, or the way that I call it, categorized stories, is struggle story. Like, I had to do this all by myself. I had to put myself through college in another country. I had to take care of my parents while other people in my family are not doing that. I had to do everything to get here and I'm exhausted. Or I had to suffer through a lot of misfortunes and difficulties. I had to move through some systems, injustices, and all of this, right? And you probably have similar type of approach to life that comes from the pattern of suffering equals being loved, or suffering and hardship equals being understood and being accepted, right? And we may not even be aware of these programming on the surface level, because on the surface level, the way that it keeps showing up is as me, poor me, going through all of these difficulties and challenges, and no one is there to rescue me, or no one is there to save me, or no one is there to understand me, no one is there to support me, no one is there to accept me, right? So this is the story of the past that I was coaching my client on. And then I thought I could share with you three very powerful tools that I have used in my own life that I would like to propose to you to use them as well if you are in a similar situation where your past is caught up with you, or your past is exacerbating your current transitioning, where you're having a lot of uncertainty anyway, but your brain is trying to sabotage you by keep saying how all the things that are bad keep happening to you, and therefore you are this person who need to be pitied, who need to be saved, who need to be somehow helped and supported, and you can't do it on your own, kind of a place, right? So, just to give you some of the examples of how my past used to be, so that you see for yourself how much I have changed my past, right? So, some of the stories you probably have heard about them, but I want to mention them here so that I can also illustrate how harsh and different my past used to be, and how I have changed that to a point that it is a totally different past, even though it is the past, right? So, the story and the experience that I grew up with as a child was adopted child in a family where other children are adopted as well. And my parents, especially my father, being a violent father, even though he had, I mean, great things, but also he was very violent towards my mom, towards my siblings. And my experience of growing up was not only poor me, who was not raised in my own biological family, and that means I must not have been loved, therefore keep continuously searching for love, while also experiencing all this violence from my father, and physical violence, right? And experiencing and feeling like I will never be the person who can live a life where violence is not part of it, right? I always thought that everyone around the world, everyone I meet, are all violent people. So this is the past of how my life started. Then I would tell all of my story of how bad everything is, how I was adopted, how this is not what I wanted, how I suffered this thing, how I suffered that famine, how I suffered the violence, and all of this. And I would tell to every person that I meet even people that I wouldn't really necessarily know, but my story always was for me. In other words, my story was I'm the victim of everything that is happening, and my life is happening around me and to me, and look at me, how bad everything is, right? So, this was the story that I grew up with. And if we were to dial it down as to what this story is really saying, is my deeper subconscious programming and assumption was I must suffer if I'm going to get love, right? I must suffer if I'm going to be successful. I must suffer if I'm going to experience the feeling of acceptance, the feeling of respect, the feeling of understanding. I must suffer in order to get the thing that I want to, right? And this is based on my experience, as I said, of my parents, but also experience of how parents at the time used to condition their children that if you don't study well, then we will punish you, essentially. Or if you don't do the things that we say you should, then we will punish you, right? So that was the past that I grew up with. So the first tool that I started realizing as I started getting coaching, as I got coached by some amazing people, the first tool that I tried out that I really want you, everyone who feels in this mode of I must suffer in order to be loved, or I must suffer in order to be accepted, try removing the conditioning. So, in other words, instead of I must do this, meaning I must suffer, right? Suffering is doing something, whether it's the hardship that you go through, whether it's the survival, whatever it is. If we remove that, meaning that you are already loved the way you are already accepted the way you are already understood and amazing the way you are already worthy the way you are, then would you still be conditioning your love to suffering? My guess is not, but this may take some time for you to really realize. And the way that you can take some time to realize is by obviously writing down is one way to do that. And I have written down a lot of different ways of I would write down all of my story of how I have lived my life all these times. And then I started looking at, okay, how do I want to actually tell my story of the past? Because the factual things were one thing, but then how I perceived and how I made the story around it and how I made myself victim in those stories, even though I was not the victim, meaning I had no say in the in being adopted, right? So therefore, if I have no say in being adopted, then why am I choosing to see that adoption as me being a victim? Because I'm assuming that my parents didn't love, my biological parents didn't love me. Then the question is, why am I assuming without ever even knowing my parents at the time? Right? So therefore, you can start seeing that if you remove the conditioning, whatever that conditioning is, I must do XYZ to be loved. I must do XYZ to be successful. I must do XYZ to be worthy. Whatever the conditioning is, if you remove it by looking at your story and say, okay, what if I am already loved, understood, accepted, successful without the suffering? How would you retell your story differently? Right? And that's what you can practice with yourself and say, okay, if I remove the all the conditioning, so if I take my client's example and say that I had to do all of this thing to be successful and get here, and instead we say, okay, what if you didn't have to, but somehow you decided to get here? So if we remove the conditioning and say, okay, what if you were always meant to be successful? It's just that this is how you found out about how to be successful, but there are a million other ways to be successful. So we start removing that hero victim story of me having overcome all of this and now life still doesn't treat me well kind of story, right? So that would be the first tool, is remove the conditioning and see if you can rewrite your story differently. And if you were to rewrite your story without the conditioning, how that would how that story would look like. And if I take my story and I say, okay, I didn't take the I remove the conditioning of I must suffer to be loved, and instead I say I've always been loved by my parents, whether I did the school well or not, whether I did the I don't know, university well or not. In fact, my parents didn't want me to study in university, right? So therefore, if I started rewriting my past, removing the conditioning that way, then how different that story looks. Or if I take my adoption story and I say, okay, I don't know if my biological parents loved me or not because I've never met them. So therefore, how would I know? But what if I have been loved, and if I haven't been loved, even if, let's say that is the case, right? Let's say that my biological parents didn't love me and they decided to give me to adoption, even though that's not true, I found out later. But at the time when I was suffering, let's say that that was the story that I was telling myself, that, okay, I don't know if they love me or not. I have never met them. So I don't need to make this into a victim story of poor me who was abandoned by their biological parents, and here I am growing up in a violent family. If I didn't have that story, then the story that I would have would be I was given to these adopted parents, and this is how my father behaved, this is how my mother behaved. And from those behaviors, what I took was that I should be somehow a victim of that situation, so that I can then later keep using that victim story as a reason for why I can't live the life I want to. And I don't want that story, and I don't want to take their behaviors to mean that I was a victim. So now what do I do with it? Right? So you can see that as soon as I remove the conditioning, new ways of looking at your past story comes up, and you start looking at, okay, what if I was never unworthy? What if I was always worthy? Then why do I keep telling my story that I'm unworthy? I have this issue, I have that. Why do I keep telling that story? And your brain may say, well, because the past evidence shows XYZ. Yes, but A, past evidence might have shown because we just bought into that story. And B, if we're no longer buying into that story anymore and we are rewriting, then how might we experience life differently? The second tool that I want to talk more about how I rewrote my past, or I changed my past, is I'm looking at my notes, right? Instead of being the victim in that story, whatever the story that I was in, I started entering or putting choice into it or decision into it. And I was coaching my client about this as well. And I was telling her, okay, instead of you keep telling that, oh, I had to put myself through college with my own means and with scholarship, instead of my parents, I had to take care of my parents, instead of my siblings, instead of keep being in that victim hero, but at the same time resentful story, what if you add or introduce choice or replace have to with I chose to, I decided to? Right? So then her story would become something like, I decided to put myself through college in the US, in her case, with a scholarship because my parents didn't have the means. And that's how I got to study and have great education that allowed me then to pursue my passion of humanitarian work. Right? Do you see how this story is so different? And most importantly, how it feels different. And the same goes for my story, right? So if I say, instead of saying, I had to suffer through all of my father's violence, and therefore, I only know that humans everywhere around the world are all violent. That would be a victim story. Instead, I put the choice into it and say, I chose to take my father's behavior to mean I'm a victim, and now I'm choosing not to be a victim. Because at the time when I was a child and I was growing up, obviously I had no choice but to be there, and that's how it is. But moving forward as I became adult, and for me, I think I've become adult for the last, I don't know, 25, 30 years. No, even more. No, 30 years maybe. So in the last 30 years, if I haven't resolved that past, then I keep referring to my parents as these are the evil people, or these are the people who didn't raise me well and therefore my life messed up, or whatever, then it is really me not taking ownership of how I am not resolving the past in the way that helps you move forward. Right. So therefore, the way that I added the choice into my story is for anything that I was experiencing at the time that I kept explaining to everyone how it is, instead of saying I had to be this victim who was abandoned by their biological parents, I had to be this poor me who had to endure UN bosses' bad behavior. I had to keep people pleasing to them and not be able to do anything about it. Then I will continue staying in the victim story. But instead, what I have decided, as soon as I add the or replace the I had to with I chose and I decided, then my story became very, very different. And I said, okay, I chose to use people pleasing as a means to cope with my boss's bad temper instead of reporting him or her. And all of a sudden, the story is like, oh my God, but why did I decide to, or why did I choose to endure and tolerate and use people pleasing as what is it called, as a means to cope with it? Well, one, I didn't know, obviously, but the other thing is that if I look at the past now and I start looking at, okay, I didn't know at the time how, but I must have chosen to do it that way because I thought that is the way to survive that world. But once I realized how that's not how I want to keep surviving that world, and I want to, excuse me, I want to be in an environment where I no longer need to keep surviving versus actually working on the impact, then I start seeing what my options are. Right? So the second tool of bringing the choice to everything becomes such an interesting story that you no longer become the victim of the past. Instead, you start realizing how you have victimized yourself or how you learn to victimize yourself by other people and how you're now choosing not to do that. And the third tool is a very similar one, but the way that I'm calling this tool is I'm in charge tool. And the reason why I love this tool and I use this everywhere in my life is if I am in charge of my life, of my freedom, of my safety, of my security, of my stability, of my trust, of my results, of my money, of my success, then I no longer use anything from the past, anything from the hustle culture, anything that I don't like to be the reason why I'm not living the life I want to. Right? So as soon as I start feeling and seeing myself, perceiving myself as someone who's fully in charge, an autonomous human being, fully in charge of her results, her success, her abundance, her life, her freedom, without any struggles, without any suffering, without any I must prove that I'm worthy topics, then I'm able to create whatever I want in life and experience whatever I want in life. Right? So therefore, you can see when we look at the past from I'm fully in charge and how I was in charge of my life back in the day, but at the time I didn't know how. So therefore I kept running into victim story, and I no longer want to keep that past in the victim way. And therefore, here is how I can look at the past with my current awareness and consciousness of how powerful and how in charge I am. Then it becomes very easy to rewrite the past, because you can see where you were making yourself a victim, where you were not taking responsibility, where you kept using your victim hero story as a way to get other people's love and attention and acceptance, without realizing you were already loved and accepted and having attention the way you want to, without ever proving, without ever suffering, without any worthiness issues. So, my dears, I hope that you will give it a try, at least one of these tools, to start looking at your past and seeing your past not as something that is a burden that keeps holding you back, that keeps bringing you all the evidence as to how you are not the person that you say you are, keeps stopping you and saying, you remember back in the day this was happened and now you can't do this, and keep somehow like uh, tethering you in the past, right? Instead of building the future, then please give it a try, one of these tools. Of the first tool, removing conditioning. If that feels a bit challenging to do, you can always look at where am I feeling a victim, or where was I a victim and why was I a victim and what I can do about it. Or the choice option of, okay, where was my choice, where was my agency and I didn't take it, and why. And the third one is, if I were in charge of all of my experiences back in the day as well as now, then what are the things that I still keep using as an excuse, as a reason not to live my fullest, powerful life? And if you need help with rewriting your past, absolutely come coach with me. Have a beautiful week. I'll talk to you very soon.